Thanks for joining Chocolates by Suzanne. You are watching one of a series of videos created to show you how to make candy centers for chocolate dipping. Today's presentation features fondant. This is not the type of fondant that you see in baking shows that's rolled out to cover a cake. This is a creamy candy center. The word fondant has French origins and means melting, coming from the same roots as fondue. This is a poured liquid sugar fondant that when beaten becomes a creamy candy center. I use this same recipe to make several centers with different flavorings that include mint, amaretto, a light fudge, and a vanilla that is dipped in chocolate and then rolled in toasted almonds. The recipe that follows the video will show different flavorings and amounts to use and makes 120 to 150 pieces depending on how large you roll each ball. You can, of course, cut the recipe down if you want to make less. For today's demonstration, I am making a small batch so it will cook and cool quickly. It is always helpful when candy making to assemble your ingredients first. We start by heating 1/3 cup of milk and 1/2 cup of cream, along with 3 tablespoons of butter. Then you'll add 2 teaspoons light corn syrup and 2 cups of sugar. You'll want to stir this until everything is dissolved and the mixture comes to a boil. I use a long-handled wooden spoon to stir all of my candy. And this is over medium to medium-high heat. Once you get your mixture boiling, you'll want to wash the sides of the pan down to avoid any sugar crystals. If there are sugar crystals left when you pour up your candy, it can change the texture as it cools, and then you'll get a grainy, sugary feel in your mouth instead of a nice, smooth center. So our mixture has started to boil now, and I'm going to use my pastry brush that's wet and wash down the sides of the pan. The water will evaporate, so it's okay. You just want to get those sugar crystals off the edges. And then for 4 or 5 minutes, you're going to cover your mixture and let it boil. That also creates steam, which helps get those sugar crystals off the side of your pan. So we're going to let it boil, and then we'll take the lid off and put our candy thermometer in and wait until it gets to 234 degrees. Now, with a candy thermometer, you do need to test, depending on your altitude, what temperature that you'll need to cook your mixture to, because at higher altitudes you cook it a little bit lower. Okay, we've had our lid on for 5 minutes boiling, and now we will put our candy thermometer in so that we can wait for it to get to our desired temperature. This will go pretty fast because it's a small batch of candy. This candy does not require constant stirring like caramel does or toffee. You can just let it boil and wait for it to reach the desired temperature and then pour it out on your marble. Right now my candy is at 232 degrees, so these last couple of degrees, just jumped to 233. So you have to really watch your thermometer those last few degrees so that you can pour it out when it reaches the desired temperature. Otherwise your candy will be a little hard, and I'll tell you how to work with that if you end up overcooking once we start beating it. We're at 233.6. I like my digital thermometer. 234, there we go. Okay, now you pour up your candy onto your marble. I just kind of do a back and forth so it's less likely to run off the edges because it cools when it hits that cool marble. And then you let it sit on your marble slab until it cools. This takes 30 to 45 minutes depending on how big your batch is. Hopefully this one will cool a little bit faster. To test if your candy is cool enough, I use my wrist and just touch it right in the center, because your wrist is very sensitive, kind of like using baby milk when you test the bottle to see if it's warm enough and not too hot for the baby. Just touching your clean wrist in the center of the candy after about 30 minutes will let you know if it's cooled enough to beat. Okay, our candy has cooled enough that we can start beating it. As you can see from the camera, it's quite translucent. You can see through it, but it's going to change and become very opaque and creamy once we start beating it. So you take your scrapers and kind of gather up your candy. It's pretty stiff because it's cool and hasn't turned creamy yet. So you're going to gather it up. Now, when you're cooking your candy, if you happen to walk away from your thermometer and your candy has overcooked by a couple of degrees, just add a teaspoon or so of cream, and that'll take the temperature back down, and then you can watch your thermometer and bring it back up to the correct temperature. If you've already poured your candy out, when you're beating it, sometimes it'll crumble if it's overcooked when you've got it in your mixer, and you can just add about a tablespoon of boiling water, and that will bring it back and make it creamy. Now, I've got two different kinds of scrapers here. This one's just a paint scraper from your hardware store, but when you wash it, you have to immediately dry it because it will get rusty, whereas this one is a food grade and does not, but it doesn't have as big of a paddle. So you kind of fold it over itself and just mix it around on your marble. And after about 10 minutes, you'll see a change in it. It kind of softens just a little bit and becomes less shiny. And really, at any time now, I could put it in my mixer and mix it, but it's still pretty stiff, and sometimes it wants to kind of flip the candy out of the mixer. Okay, we've been beating our candy for about 10 minutes now, and so I'm going to put it into the bowl, my mixing bowl, get all those little bits. If you let it just sit on your marble or any extra that you scrape out of your pan onto a dish, it goes kind of sugary, so it has to be beat in order to turn creamy. If it's just left alone, it will turn sugary. So I'm going to put it in my mixer. And start mixing. Now, once the mixer is going and it starts to turn creamy, that's when you'll add all of your flavorings. You will add 1/4 teaspoon of vanilla, unless you're making vanilla centers, and then you'll add a full 1/2 teaspoon. 4 or 5 drops of peppermint oil or almond oil. You don't want to use extracts, you want to use oil. And then for chocolate centers, you melt 1/2 square of unsweetened chocolate to put in it. Also, for my amaretto centers, I add a few drops of red food coloring to give it kind of a pink center, just for visual interest. And I also add about 1/4 teaspoon of cherry flavoring. It brings out that amaretto flavoring, enhances it. So just a really small amount will make a big impact on your flavor. If your candy crumbles when you are beating it in the mixer, like I said, you can add a tablespoon of boiling water and then let it beat for a little while, and that should bring it back to where it's creamy and not crumbling. Once your candy has been beat and it's that nice creamy texture, you scoop it into a large glass bowl and cover it tightly with plastic wrap and refrigerate it generally overnight. When the candy is cooled and is set up, you take a spoon and scoop out about the size of a large marble and roll it in your hands, but you want to make sure your hands are very clean and not too warm, because you'll start to melt the candy if your hands are too warm. So you'll set them, once you're rolling them out, you put them on a baking sheet that has wax paper lined, and just line them up neatly in rows and roll out to the sizes that you are looking for, and then put them back in the refrigerator until you're ready to dip them. You can post any comments or if you have any questions, and I'll answer them for you. Thanks for watching, and please subscribe. Hi, welcome back to Chocolates by Suzanne. Today I'm going to be dipping amaretto creams. This is the same fondant recipe that we used for the chocolate creams, the mint, and the toasted almond balls. The amaretto is made with amaretto oil, not extract. You roll them into 1-inch balls, just like the others. Push them down a little bit so they're kind of flat on top. You don't want the rounded mound to come up over the top of your cup. I mark the amaretto with an A, and I use a cursive A because I think it looks prettier. Dip it in the chocolate, upside down in your fingers. Turn it right side up onto your wax paper. And I drip the chocolate off of my little finger to make the A. I'll show you a couple more here. You don't want to hold these in your hands too long because they are creamy and they will melt and flatten, and then they're much more difficult to work with. And I just drip the chocolate off my little finger to make an A. Creams are tough to work with, especially your first few times, because of their softness. You might want to practice dipping nuts. Toast your almonds or your pecans in the oven, and when they're cool, dip the nuts individually. There's no markings on them, but that way you get a feel for the chocolate and the dipping, and those nuts won't change shape when you hold on to them. And that's our amaretto creams. Thanks for watching.